Elias Thorne did not see the world as a fan. He saw it as a series of failure points. As the lead cybersecurity architect for the upcoming 2026 World Cup, his eyes were permanently fixed on the digital perimeter of a tournament spanning 3 nations. For most, the event was a triumph of sport, but for Elias, it was a debt he owed to the past. Years ago, he had been inside a stadium when a structural collapse turned a massive cheering crowd into a sea of terror. The screams of that day were the silent soundtrack of his life, driving a fanatical obsession with safety. He oversaw the smart stadium infrastructure, a billion-dollar network of AI surveillance and biometric gates. Elias believed with enough code, he could finally silence the painful and haunting ghosts of his past. The scale was monumental. With 48 teams across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, the World Cup security web had to be absolutely perfect. Every ticket was linked to a biometric profile, and every camera was part of an AI unified brain tracking 1 million faces in real time. This massive billion-dollar investment was a testament to a world that believed technology could solve human chaos. But as the opening match drew near, Elias found a ghost in the code. Stress testing the facial recognition systems in a U.S. host city, he discovered a recurring glitch, a specific biometric signature the system was programmed to ignore. Someone had built a digital shadow, allowing them to move through checkpoints without leaving a single trace or digital footprint. When Elias brought the evidence to the high-level organizing committee, he expected a state of emergency. Instead, he was met with a wall of cold, bureaucratic silence. The committee members, focused on optics and the VIP experience, dismissed his findings as a minor calibration error. They handed him a formal gag order, explaining that the tournament's success depended on the illusion of total and absolute control. They told him the blind spot was a necessary bypass for high-level interests that required discrete movement. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias stood in the boardroom, realizing that the system wasn't broken by accident. It had been compromised by design, sold out to accommodate the people who operated above the law. The architectural masterpiece he had created to protect the public was being used as a cloak for those who wished to remain unseen. The weight of this cold betrayal became a physical ache when Elias reviewed the final roster for the upcoming opening ceremony. His daughter, a gifted and elite performer, was scheduled to lead a group in the center of the pitch during the most vulnerable window of the tournament's debut. She was part of a massive, intricate choreography that would place her directly in the path of the system's greatest failure. His professional audit had suddenly transformed into a desperate, private race to save his own blood from a terrifying and looming disaster he had helped facilitate. The very gates he had meticulously designed to keep danger away were now wide open, and his child was standing on the other side of a dark digital abyss. At midnight, in the shadows of a rain-slicked parking garage, Elias met a whistleblower who finally confirmed his worst fears. The man, a lead developer who had suddenly resigned weeks prior, handed him an encrypted file. The vulnerability wasn't just a local glitch, it was a hard-coded backdoor baked into the central server governing the systems of all 3 host nations. The blind spot was universal, a master key that gave an unknown shadowy entity total control over the stadium's life support systems, exits, and communications. The 2026 World Cup wasn't just a sporting event anymore. It was a billion-dollar trap waiting for someone to spring it. The smart stadium had a hidden master, and Elias was the only person left in the control center who knew the key was already in the lock. Elias retreated into the digital shadows, operating from a transient hotel room on the outskirts of the city where the flickering neon signs looked like dying stars against the rain. He knew the committee's gag order was more than just a legal threat. It was a physical mark on his back. Using a decentralized VPN and a series of encrypted tunnels he had built for his own private contingencies, he began to peel back the layers of the central server's hard-coded architecture. The backdoor was surgical, a masterpiece of malicious engineering that bypassed every security layer he had spent years perfecting. It wasn't just a way to sneak unauthorized personnel into the venues, it was a full command and control override. As he traced the origin of the protocol, the digital trail led him away from bureaucratic agencies and toward a massive private military contractor hired to assist with the Mexican and Canadian borders. This entity, brought in to provide logistical support, had actually embedded its own heartbeat into the very pulse of the entire North American tournament. The air in the room felt thin as Elias realized the contractor's reach. They weren't just watching the borders, they were controlling the entire flow of information across 3 nations. Outside his window, a black SUV with tinted windows had been idling for nearly 4 hours. The intimidation wasn't subtle. It was a cold, deliberate message. They wanted him to know that they owned the perimeter now, and he was being watched by the very sensors he had helped calibrate. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played across a continent-sized chessboard. Elias felt the walls closing in, realizing he was no longer the architect of a fortress, but a prisoner trapped within its invisible digital walls. The deeper Elias dug, the more horrific the blind spot became. It wasn't merely a hole in the surveillance, it was a total system kill switch. The code allowed for a synchronized blackout of stadium communications, cellular signals, and every automated emergency exit. In a moment of crisis, the system could be used to trap tens of thousands of people inside a concrete bowl, cutting them off from the outside world while the security response was directed by an external, unaccountable entity. The image of a crowded stadium turning into a slaughterhouse, with the exits locked by a line of silent code, paralyzed him. He thought of the stadium collapse he had survived years ago, the feeling of being crushed and helpless. This was that nightmare reborn, amplified by $1 billion of technology and a total lack of oversight. Desperate for an ally, Elias reached out to the one person he still trusted, his mentor, the veteran strategist who had brought him into the project. They met in a quiet, secluded park under the cover of a gray morning. But the threat wasn't approaching from the trees, it was sitting right in front of him. When Elias showed him the evidence of the contractor's involvement, his mentor didn't look surprised. Instead, he looked broken. With a trembling voice, the man confessed. He had authorized the backdoor. A lifetime of high-stakes gambling had left him with massive debts that even an elite career couldn't cover. The private military contractor had offered him a way out, a massive offshore payout in exchange for a few administrative lines of code. The man Elias had looked up to as a pillar of integrity had sold the safety of millions to save his own skin. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. Elias was now standing on a precipice with no safety net. If he took this evidence to the authorities, he would be violating every non-disclosure agreement he had ever signed, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. The tournament would be canceled, and he would be branded a global cyber terrorist. But if he stayed silent, he would be an accomplice to whatever horror the contractor was planning. And at the center of that horror was his daughter, whose face smiled at him from a promotional poster on a nearby bus stop. The decision was made for him when a final, deeply hidden file decrypted on his laptop. It was a simulation, a blueprint for a coordinated attack planned for the quarterfinals, the tournament's most watched match. The blind spot was scheduled to be exploited in exactly 72 hours. This wasn't just a vulnerability anymore. It was a countdown to a catastrophe that would be televised to the entire world. The master key was about to be turned, and Elias Thorne was the only man who knew the lock was about to break. The roar of the massive crowd above was a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the thick, reinforced concrete walls of the data center. As the world watched the opening kickoff of the monumental quarterfinal match, Elias moved through the subterranean shadows like a ghost haunting his own system. He wasn't in the stands with a ticket. He was 3 levels below the pitch, breathing recycled air. Every step toward the central server room was a calculated betrayal of the security protocols he had once helped establish. Using his master biometric override, he knew that touching the central console would permanently etch his digital footprint into the global database as a hostile invader. Inside the server room, the air was freezing and filled with the high-pitched whine of cooling fans. This was the nervous system of the entire North American tournament, a sprawling network of fiber optics that bridged 3 nations into a single vulnerable eye. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He could see the contractor's malware beginning to wake up, a digital parasite preparing to feast on the stadium's infrastructure. The script was designed to lock every automated emergency exit and disable the lighting, creating an inescapable cage for the fans. Elias saw his daughter's performance schedule. She was positioned directly in the center of the pitch. The countdown showed 3 minutes until impact. To kill the backdoor, a simple patch was not enough. The infection was too deep, woven into the kernel by his own mentor's hand. The only way to save the lives above was to initiate a total, irreversible system purge, a scorched earth protocol that would reset the security architecture to its factory defaults. This Red Sunday protocol was meant only for catastrophic failures. Initiating it would automatically flag Elias as a cyber terrorist across every international agency. There would be no trial, no explanation that would satisfy the corporate interests he was about to humiliate. His career, his reputation, and his life were the fuel for this fire. Without hesitation, he entered the final, irrevocable command string. The roar above intensified as a goal was scored, but down in the dark, the digital battle reached its zenith. The contractor's remote operators realized someone was tampering with the feed. A digital firewall rose to block Elias's purge. He countered with a recursive loop, a technique he had perfected years ago after the stadium tragedy that had shaped his personal mission. His heart hammered in time with the crowd's rhythmic cheering. With only 10 seconds remaining, the screens flashed a brilliant cold crimson. The back door slammed shut. The malicious code was deleted, replaced by the clean architecture of the original build. The locks stayed open. The panic never came. Elias leaned back, the silence of the server room feeling heavier than the noise. He watched the security monitors as the match reached its peaceful conclusion. In the camera feed, he saw his daughter waving to the crowd, her bright, safe smile visible under the stadium lights. She was safe, and that was the only currency that mattered. When the heavy doors burst open, the tactical team didn't ask for his side of the story. They tackled him to the floor, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. As they led him through the tunnels, he saw the jubilant fans pouring out of the exits he had sacrificed his future to keep open. Weeks later, in the quiet of a cold federal cell, Elias watched a small television. A news anchor reported that the security instability had been neutralized by a rogue cybersecurity architect now in custody. There was no mention of the PMC or his mentor's betrayal. Instead, a ticker noted that the firm had rebranded as Aegis Global and secured the contract for the next Olympics. The blind spots hadn't been fixed. They had simply changed names. Elias watched from his silent cell, knowing he had won the small battle for one afternoon, while the war for the dangerous shadows continued in the dark.